Well, apparently all those Herculean efforts to find a compromise over the issue of slavery were about as effective as a jellyfish trying to blow up balloons for a birthday party, you know? So, because they don't have lungs, so not effective, you know? Okay, guess I need to cross Skyphozoan-based comedy off my list for hilarious video hooks. Anyway, the compromise failed, and that's going to lead to civil war, and that's what this video is about. So if you're ready to get them brain cows milked, let's get to it. Okay, so a couple of videos ago, we talked about the Compromise of 1850, in which Henry Clay did his fighting best to make a juicy compromise sandwich that would put to rest the broiling sectional tensions over the expansion of slavery into the West. And that was 1850, and by 1860, states began seceding from the Union, and that would cause the Civil War. So what in the fresh heck happened in the intervening decade? Well, there were two more major attempts to solve the slavery debate, and those attempts made things absolutely worse. First was the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. So remember that the Missouri Compromise of 1820 established that territories north of the 3630 line would be closed to slavery, while those south of the line would remain open to slavery. And most important to remember is that this agreement only applied to the territory gained in the Louisiana Purchase. But if you've been following along during this unit, you will no doubt remember that after the Mexican-American War, the U.S. won roughly 5 metric buttloads of land in the Mexican Cession, and that 3630 business did not apply to that territory. And that's what the Compromise of 1850 tried and ultimately failed to settle. So the point is, the slavery question and all this land right here had been altogether settled for 30 years. I mean, pro-slavery and anti-slavery folks had plenty of problems, but this was not one of them. But Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas woke up one morning and decided that he was ready to make it a problem. Oh, and by the way, if you want Noteguides to follow along with this video and all my videos, then that link is in the description. Anyway, Douglas was real desirous to get one of the nation's new transcontinental railroads to pass through his state of Illinois. But in order to do that, the federal government would have to take control of the unorganized territory west of Illinois in order to complete the route. And just in case you didn't grow up in the golden age of transcontinental railroads, let me just tell you that having one of these sweet bippies cross your state would mean a whole lot of pocket cabbage for the population in question. So that's why Southerners were competing with Douglas for an alternative route for the railroad that favored their states. So what Douglas did to sweeten the deal for his southern congressional brethren was to introduce the Kansas-Nebraska Act. It proposed that 2 new territories be formed from the unorganized territory, namely Kansas and Nebraska, and the population of each territory would decide by popular sovereignty whether to allow slavery. In other words, despite the mandate of the Missouri Compromise, Douglas was willing to court Southern support by opening the possibility of the expansion of slavery above the 3630 line. And ultimately, Douglas was successful and the bill became law. And while this made Southerners happy, many Northerners were enraged since the law overturned the Missouri Compromise and served as evidence for the growing slave power of the Southern states. And I know it might be hard to believe, but this actually went very badly. As I mentioned in previous videos, although the notion of popular sovereignty seems like a good idea and one that upholds the principles of liberty, the practical implementation of it was never clear-cut. Case in point, it was now federal law that the people of Kansas and Nebraska would vote for themselves on the slavery question. But Douglas never really explained how this kind of voting would work, nor did he comment on several difficult issues that would arise as a result of this policy. For example, if a territory was already home to a population of slaveholders and it voted to abolish slavery, then what would happen to the enslaved people and the planters who claimed ownership over them? And all those unanswered questions led to a proper bloodbath when it came time for Kansas to become a state in 1854. So like 5 minutes after the Kansas-Nebraska Act passed, thousands of pro-slavery and anti-slavery advocates flooded into Kansas from surrounding states in order to sway the vote. In fact, so many people were arriving into Kansas by the day that it was nearly impossible for the authorities to determine who was eligible to vote and who was not. It would kind of be like if in the next presidential election, hundreds of thousands of Canadians rushed across the border and voted for a US president that they thought would be best for Canada. And I'm sure they would apologize profusely for it and run back across the border for a hearty Tim Hortons breakfast, but you get the point. So although the majority of Kansans wanted to enter the Union as a free state, border ruffians who had flooded in from Missouri tipped the vote toward making Kansas a slave state. Massive fail for popular sovereignty. Now, it was pretty clear to everyone that the illegal pro-slavery voters had upended the will of the Kansan people, and as a result, the rival factions established 2 opposing state governments. The pro-slavery Kansas government was set up in Shawnee Mission, while the anti-slavery government was established in Lawrence. And not long after, pro-slavery Kansans attacked the anti-slavery government in Lawrence, which resulted in the death of 1 person and a significant amount of property destruction. And battles between the 2 factions raged for months, and in the end, 50 Americans were dead in what became known as Bleeding Kansas. It was an on-again, off-again conflict that lasted until 1859, and what it told Americans is that the slavery debate was only going to be settled by blood. And that commitment was on display once again in 1856 in the very chambers of the U.S. Senate in the caning of Charles Sumner. So in that year, Republican Senator Charles Sumner delivered a blistering speech in Congress denouncing slavery and the rising slave power in the South. And he was not vague in his denunciation. No sirree, he was about as subtle as a stomach pump. So Sumner directed his attack against Southern politicians among the planter elite, specifically Andrew Butler of South Carolina. Now, as it turned out, Butler's nephew, a House representative by the name of Preston Brooks, was in no mood to abide such an insult to his family's honor. So Brooks entered the Senate chambers, walked up to Sumner, and beat the man with his cane until he was nearly dead. Now, not surprisingly, Northerners were outraged by this brutality and held Sumner up as a martyr for the free soil cause. Southerners, on the other hand, held up Brooks as a hero, and in fact, Brooks received dozens of new canes sent to him by Southern supporters. And look, side note here, sometimes students ask me if our current political moment is as bad and divisive as it's ever been. Answer, no. Like, until our Congress people are beating each other to death with blunt objects, it could be worse. And speaking of getting worse, it's now time to introduce you to a Supreme Court case that really turned up the heat on the sectional tension over slavery. So in 1857, the court ruled on Dred Scott v. Sanford, and here are the details in brief. Dred Scott was an enslaved man whose owner had taken him to live in Illinois and Wisconsin, both of which were free states. And by Scott's reckoning, if he had lived on free soil, that meant he ought to be a free man, and so he sued his owner for freedom. But the Chief Justice Roger Taney, an altogether pro-slavery man, delivered the decision which ruled that an enslaved person was not a citizen and therefore had no legal rights, not least the right to sue in court. And yeah, that's bad, but not altogether unexpected for the time. But the real egg in the sock was that this decision established the precedent that slaveholders could not be deprived of their property even in free states. And in case you still don't feel the heat of that explosive claim, let me say it plain. It meant that, in effect, every U.S. state and territory was now open to the expansion of slavery. And so as a result, Northerners cried foul at the further undoing of the Missouri Compromise and were angered yet again at more evidence of the growing slave power in the South. I mean, the fugitive slave law had already required Northerners to participate in the perpetuation of slavery, but after the Dred Scott case, there was literally no square inch of American soil that was safe from the expansion of the institution. So the point is, slavery had finally and fully broken the U.S. into two rival regional factions, and that's going to have one more big effect. So before the 1850s, the two political parties of the United States had members and supporters from the entire nation, even if their constituencies were unequally distributed regionally. For example, the Democrats had both a northern faction and a southern faction, etc. However, by 1854, the second party system was falling apart, and in its place, political parties arose that represented the strict sectional division of the nation. So in the congressional election of 1854, the Whigs lost real bad since the public perceived that they had utterly failed to stop the slave power from taking over the federal government. And then the American Party, or the Know-Nothings, won some impressive victories, but once slavery overshadowed the immigrant problem, the party's power began to wane. Therefore, during the 1854 election, the new party system included the pro-slavery Democrats and the free soil Republicans. And the point to remember about these parties is that they catered almost exclusively to sectional interests. The Republicans were concentrated in the North and advocated the free soil position, which is to say they agreed to leave slavery alone where it existed and prevent the expansion of slavery. The Democrats were concentrated in the South and advocated for the position of states' rights and the expansion of slavery into the West. However, I should mention that there were internal divisions within each party as well. Like, some Republicans didn't want to be associated with violent radicals like John Brown, while Democrats struggled to please Northern and Southern factions in their party. Regardless, in the presidential election of 1860, this sectional political split would ultimately lead the U.S. right into civil war. Well, okay, you can click here to watch my other videos from Unit 5, or you can click here to grab my video note guides, which are going to help you get all the contents of this course firmly crammed into your brain folds. I'm glad you came around, and I'll catch you on the flip-flop. Heimler out.